We come to the sixth presentation of Quintessential Dimensions of Consciousness. And let's refresh our focus. Consciousness is an ecology of dimensions. And for that ecology of dimensions to develop, it develops in a pair of spirals. The classic way 2,000 years ago to portray the spiritual person was to compose the features in a spiral, the center of which was one of the eyes, so that one would have a slight angle, not fully faced on. That would be a political portrait. A spiritual portrait was always slightly offset, and the spiral would begin with one of the eyes and move out to the rest of the features that would be noticeable in a spiral ambulation of one's perception. The reason for this was to obviate identification, to obviate a bar alignment of perception with conception, that the portrait spiritually was an artistic composition. The classic developer of this in Greek sculpture was Scopas. And Scopas was very, very famous in antiquity for being able to do this. And by the 1st century AD, the spiritual portrait, while not used very often, the greatest artists of that era used that technique. Not only did the spiral go out, but one could follow from the outside back in and spiral back into the eye, so that one was able to come to a vanishing point, because the eye has for its focus the pupil. And the pupil of the eye, not being phenomenal, but being a noumen, not a noumenon, but noumen, being a spirit, it allows for the penetration of light by its rays to enter the eye and to compose the imagery into a new form. Instead of being like a mirror of what one would perceive, which is the way conception works, it would be a creative composition that would also be memorable in the sense that it was based on recognition rather than on cognition. To train oneself in this way was the ancient technique developed by Pythagoras called retrospection. At the end of the day, one would do a retrospection through that particular sunset time back through the events of the day backwards. And in going backwards, one would acquaint oneself with not the mirror of the day as in reflection, which is a conceptual technique, but the complementarity to the day, which is the retrospection of it. So that one has a completely different model of the way in which the human being is presented. In the natural sense, where the mind is a mirror, the concept uses the phenomenality of the world to make a representation in the imagination. The images of it are directly related and become then a source of cognition, of identification, of that kind of an alignment. Whereas the conscious dimensions were that of a portrait of this double spiraling motion. The classic presentation of the difference between the two outlooks. The mind is a mirror based on reflection and identification. The mind open to further dimensions of spirit, where the person emerged prismatic rather than as a reflection, so that the identification was not possible, and in fact, the spiritual portrait revealed that the spiritual person can transform the world by literally not just transforming the things of the world, but by transforming the very dimensions by which the world occurs in the first place, space and time. And the retrospection was to run time backwards so that one got used to the technique that we do not just accept the world as it is and base our conceptions upon it. That would be being captive to a cycle. And no matter how powerful the cycle comes to its completion, it is, in a further dimensional sense, a fiction. It is fictive. Next week we'll talk more about the wonderful way in which the origins of political economy were developed in the early 19th century, especially by Jeremy Bentham and David Ricardo, Adam Smith, and John Stuart Mill. And Bentham's theory of fictions is an extraordinary, refined way of understanding why a political economy became the basis of an industrial revolution, which swept away all of the classic constraints, all of the classic filters that had been engendered up until then, and one found a runaway political economy towards the middle and end of the 19th century that in the 20th century jumped to scales where world dominion again became the ideal of power groups and of some one power group that would then take over the entirety of the globe. What we're looking at in this sixth presentation is a way in which the classic formulation in that first generation after Pythagoras, where retrospection became as refined as the inspection while one lived through the day, the retrospection at sunset took one back to the beginning of the day, and if you began the day with hymns to the dawn, spiritually sung by oneself or by one's companions who constituted a group, or by a larger group, a community. This was the ancient way of celebrating the beginning of the day and the end of the day without doing an alignment of identification, but of making a double movement so that the day itself had a strophe, a metanoia turn, and an antistrophe coming back, and that where one started and where one turned and where one came back to were locuses of higher dimension on a double spiraling, a spiraling out to the cosmos, a spiraling in to one's prismatic higher person. Not oneself, not one's individuality. These were symbolic constructs. But bringing one's character, which was the lifestyle of your inheritance, the character of you as a being, who can experience, who can image, who can feel, who can learn to think and symbolize, but learn also that one can look through the symbolic structure, look through the mirror quality. And one of the all-time great simple ways of expressing this was Lewis Carroll. Alice in Wonderland is followed by a sequel, Through the Looking Glass. Through the mind as a mirror to paradoxical dimensions that the mind as a mirror could imagine, could theorize in an intellectual way, but could not really enter into as a dimension. Classically, this became, wherever it was practiced, a form of what we would call idealism, with an emphasis on the ism. We talked about 2 presentations ago of how the classic idealism hit Mahayana Buddhism about the late 300s, early 400s AD with the development of the Yogacara, which seemed to be based on consciousness only. That was its program. And we talked about a translation made of On Knowing Reality, the Tattvartha chapter of Asanga's Bodhisattva Bhumi. The consciousness only was so refined in its conception, in its symbolic structure, that it took more than 400 years to be able to see through the deception. And the way that it was seen through was that the original prism of consciousness was revisited in such a way that there was a continuous retrospection through those centuries by genius individuals in the late 700s AD in Asia, and they were able to go back and find the exact beginning of the spiraling out of conscious dimensions in its full ecology, and then retrospectively be able to bring themselves current in their own time. And the 3 great figures in Buddhism of the day around 800 AD. In Japan, you had Kukai, who was extremely famous. He founded a monastery on Mount Koya, just a couple of hours drive southeast from Kyoto, which is a big resort now, a holy place with giant cedar trees, almost like sequoia trees. And there are many hotels, but there are special monasteries where one can spend the night. And one spends the night in a deep contemplative community that is shared by tens of thousands of people each night. And in the morning, they greet each other with the dawn, with participating in a special ceremony, the Abhisheka. The Abhisheka is that holy water is taken and you are baptized with it on your forehead, third eye, and then you take a flower and you cast that flower onto a mandala, And where it lands at the mandala is the beginning of the eye, of penetration. And one can follow then through the mandala from that particular starting point, and that is not the divination of where you are or what you're going to do, but it is the recognition for you to have a beginning place to explore then the way of spiraling out and spiraling in. This particular baptism is called Esoteric Buddhism, and it is directly related to Jesus and John the Baptist, and got to Asia through St. Thomas originally, got into Buddhism through Ashvaghosha, the awakening of faith in the Mahayana, not the awakening of extinction, moksha, the awakening of Shraddha, faith, in the Great Way. And all of this became not only there on Mount Koya, but Mount Heian, just part of that same mountain range just east of Kyoto. And that sect is called the Tiantai, the heavenly sect. So esoteric Christianity, not the Christian church, but Jesus' Great Way, had a revival about 800 AD in Japan. It was resonated to in Tibet at the same time by Padmasambhava, who founded the Vajrayana. Also resonated at the same time in India by Shantideva, whose Bodhicharyavatara on entering the path of enlightenment shows in 10 chapters the way in which this spiraling, both spiraling out and spiraling in, is the way of the Bodhisattva, the Great Way, and at the eye of the spiraling, Shantideva says, one must guard to preserve the pristine secret of the Great Way, which is the secret exchange of selves. That because one's self is not one's true person, it can be shared with another. And their self, because it is not their true self, can be shared with another. And the way that this is done is that the resonances of the radiances are put into a harmonic. As the book of Job put it, there is a timeless time when all the stars sang together. That's God's realm. William Blake's great engraving of that is one of the all-time great works of art, where four great angels with their arms around each other and their wings up are singing together, and the cosmos has a particular hum to it. It is the hum of a cosmic tone that allows for all scalars of music to have meaning in terms of application and technique. The quality that came from Pythagoras in the first generation was summarized by Parmenides, who was like a William Blake figure we've talked about a little bit, with long white hair, flowing white robes, and his mystical poem is called The Way. And in it, Parmenides has a phrase which is a conundrum for the reflective mind, but which is an insight for the recognition mind of consciousness. The phrase translated into English, what is, what isn't, isn't. They never meet. There is no bridge between them. Yet there is a symmetry between them, which is fertile. Some 100 years after St. Thomas went to India, in the same South Indian areas, St. Thomas is buried in, on what is still called St. Thomas Hill, in what used to be called Madras, a very large city in South India, is now called Chennai. And from that place, if one went up the Coromandel coast, one would come to the estuary of one of the large rivers, the Krishna River. And just inland from there is Amaravati, and a little further inland, another 100 miles or so, is Nargajuna Kanda, the hill of Nargajuna. Nargajuna was not only one of the greatest meditators in world history, but he was one of the great architects. He built both Amaravati and Nargajuna Kanda. The city close to that would be Hyderabad. Nargajuna, who lived to be almost 100 years old, has 70 stanzas on emptiness, and two of them, stanza 18 and stanza 19, are the pristine presentation of why consciousness as a dimension does not need to touch the four dimensions of space-time, and in fact do not. Yet there is a resonance capable between the pair. The translation of stanza 18 is, if phenomena are devoid of inherent existence, then they will be completely non-existent, like the horns of a rabbit. And so there can be no occurrence of their arising or their cessation. As Buddha has spoken about arising and cessation, they must exist. So how can things be devoid of inherent existence? This opponent has also misunderstood our teaching about phenomena being empty of true existence or inherent existence. He mistakenly believes that when we say that phenomena lack inherent existence, we mean that they lack any existence at all. And that our view is that phenomena are completely non-existent. So he asks, how can a non-existent phenomena arise or cease? He goes on to refute our view by asserting that arising and ceasing must exist because Buddha used these terms. We answer in the next stanza. An object cannot simultaneously arise as a functioning phenomena and cease as a non-functional phenomena. If a non-functional phenomena does not exist, then a functional phenomena cannot exist because an object cannot arise and endure as a functional phenomena without depending on its cessation as a non-functional phenomenon, or else it would exist at all times. If non-functional phenomena, which is different from a functional phenomena, does not exist, then it is impossible for functional phenomena to exist. This is the core of the quantum puzzle. It is the exact locus which gets covered in a projective ism, and one comes to such a concept as zero-point energy, which is very common in parlance today. Zero is not a point. It is a quality where the zero-ness of it is something that belongs to a dimension of consciousness. And that dimension of consciousness is a field. And the pair of that field in complementarity is the field of nature. But whereas the field of nature is not a 0-point field, but a zero field, the field of consciousness is an infinite field. So that one has a symmetry of emptiness and infiniteness. And not only is there a symmetry, but there is a complementarity in the sense that they can exchange centers. The center of the zero field of nature is that the integral be completed. And the completion of the integral is to be able to bring the entire cycle of existence through its life forms experience into mental structures of symbolic thought, and to bring that symbolic thought to a single point. The Sanskrit word for that single point is ekagrata, single-pointedness of mind. And it takes a lot of sophistication and dedication, but one can bring oneself to that single point. That single-pointedness, if conceived as an identification then of the essence of the world, will occur in the mind as one's true self, as one's soul. The Sanskrit word for that is the Atman. However, if you continue with a double cycle of meditation, one of recognition and one of retrospection at the same time, that single-pointedness will vanish. And vanish in such a sense that one beholds not only the zero field of nature, but resonantly the infinite field of consciousness. And in this particular double samadhi, one awakens because the seed of a spiritual person, a prismatic form, occurs to bring the recognition to an active personal focus. The base upon which this is expressed symbolically. The Tibetan phrase is Om Ara Patsi Nada. Hail to the jewel in the lotus. The jewel is the diamond. The lotus is the flowering of the infinite field of consciousness to rise and present a focus for the radiance of the jewel to begin to develop its facets. The development of the facets of the jewel, jewel in Sanskrit is vajra. Its facets are developed by cutting the gem, so that the diamond cutter sutra, Vajra Chadika sutra, is the way in which one cuts the facets of one's jewel within the lotus of one's presencing within the infinite field of consciousness. That lotus rises in the infinity to host the jewel. And if one reads carefully in a deep following of a sutra in Sanskrit means thread, one not only follows this thread like the original Theravada sutras, but one follows the thread forwards and backwards at the same time. So that if one looks at the structure of the Vajrachedikra Sutra, the first part leads up to a single word, and the second part is the mirror of that first part, leading all the way back to the beginning of the sutra, so that one could read it backwards or forwards, either way, and the pivot would be the same word in the center of it. This, by the way, is the technique used by Homer in the Iliad. The Iliad is a parenthesis of perfectly balanced events, supposedly before and supposedly after, that come exactly together in the middle of the Iliad on the word of the death of Patroclus, which spawns the wrath of Achilles. Patroclus is killed because Achilles is pouting and is not there, and Patroclus has always been the right-hand man of Achilles in battle, and because he was not used to being the central warrior, he was unprepared. He was prepared to always be the right-hand man of Achilles, but Achilles not being there as the senior warrior, he was the one who was given the chance of making sure that there was someone on the line. And of course, the prize warrior opposite of him, Hector, not only killed Patroclus, but dragged his body behind his chariot in front of all of the Greek troops to show them disdain. The Diamond Cutter Sutra is derived because the cutting of the gem originally appears in the writings of Philo of Alexandria in the time of Jesus. And for Philo, the phrase was the logos cutter. The logos as the word is the refinement of the jewel of the person in the infinite field of the heavenly realm. Because the dimension of visionary consciousness is literally the heavenly realm. It's not the earthly realm. It is not the cycle of founding oneself and keeping oneself masterfully, powerfully at the top of the worldly realm, but of giving it out to openness, giving it up to being ready for a transform. And the reason why consciousness is an ecology is that one must be able to refine one's person to be able to achieve a resonance with the cosmos. As long as one thought about it, it was a universe. But when one is recognizing increasingly and maturing, it becomes, the phrase in Tibetan translates as a jewel matrix. It is an infinite matrix of jewels, but it has a peculiar quality to it. Whereas in existence, in the natural cycle, in order for there to be quanta, they must be separated from each other. Otherwise, they would not be able to be quanticized. By what are they separated? By nothing. By precisely nothing. So that in between all of the ones are unexpressed zeros. But in consciousness, in the ecology of consciousness, what is in between the prismatic facets is infinity. And so one can characterize by zeros and ones anything in the integral cycle. But in order to deal with consciousness, one has to characterize by ones and infinities. And when you put them into a complementarity, and you run that complementarity into its harmonic, the harmonic tunes itself to a third kind of a binary, the binary of zero and infinity. It is at that particular threshold that hyperspace comes into form. It is not in the natural cycle. It's not in the conscious ecology, but emerges because those two have been tuned together in such a way that they develop a complementarity, and it's out of that complementarity that the form of a 10-dimensional hyperspace comes into existence. Not into existence, but into being. Not into being, but as a hyperspace. When we come back from the break, we're going to take a look at the Green Bill of Rights. 10 rights that we must claim for ourselves. These are not rights limited to political, but rather unlimitedly real. The first of them, consciousness, ecology, works in complementarity to nature cycle. The 4 dimensions of the natural cycle and the 4 dimensions of the ecology of consciousness are like a scalar 8 that come together in a very special way that make a form where the unexpressed thumbs of the hand are hidden within it as if they were the perfected jewel within that lotus. Let's take a little break. Before we come to the Green Bill of Rights, and to come to appreciate why at this particular threshold the dimensions of consciousness are necessary for continued life, I want to introduce a word which many of you have probably never heard of. The word is Gaon. This is the autobiography of John Archibald Wheeler, who lived to be 97, died last year. And this autobiography, Gaon's Black Holes and Quantum Foam. He's the one that coined all these words, and who developed the S-matrix theory in particle physics. A Gaon concentrations of radiant energy so intense that they are held together by their own gravity. In looking at Wheeler on the web, there's a series of maybe 50 or 60 short excerpts that are strung together as a great interview with him in his mid-90s. One of the startling aspects that comes out about 30 episodes in, he was the teacher of Richard Feynman, among other people. He and Feynman worked out a way to mathematically characterize the positron as an electron that moves backwards in time. That a positive charged electron, the positron, does not occur in the natural time cycle of time arrow forward, but occurs in its complementarity of time running backwards. So that it is not a matter simply of charge. There are two other pairs in the tuning of existentiality, other than charge, normally understood as positive and negative. There is spin, which is right-handed or left-handed. And there is a third pair that we will talk about 3 presentations forward, called strangeness. In fact, it is talked about as a flavor. In trying to find a poetic language to characterize what cannot be identified, not only that one cannot identify it with any traditional understanding, but that identification itself is a deceptive technique to be eschewed. So that it makes it almost paradoxical to be able to talk language about consciousness or any aspect of the conscious ecology. You cannot talk about it. Language must be presentational. In that flavor, because as soon as language is presentational, the flavor reveals a supersymmetry to the symmetricality of integrals. One of the little publications that I mentioned a couple of presentations ago, Quantum Physics and Ordinary Language. And I mentioned that this copy was discarded by the California Lutheran College Library. I bought it on the net for a couple of bucks, maybe 10 years ago. Published in 1972. More to the point, at MIT, linguistics took a huge leap forward several generations ago when one of the most brilliant of the Russian St. Petersburg intellectuals fled Stalin's persecutions, came to the United States. His name is Roman Jacobson, died a while ago. Jacobson is the founder of a sophisticated linguistics. When Jacobson was a young man in St. Petersburg, his best friend was the great revolutionary poet Mayakovsky. So he grew up with poets and artists all the time, and he was an artist in linguistics. And his star grad was Noam Chomsky. One of Chomsky's many great books is called Transformational Syntax, a student's guide to Chomsky's extended standard theory. And next week we'll talk about transformational grammars as well as transformational syntax. But for now, just to introduce and accentuate, this is a little Chomsky booklet, Language and Mind. He writes, I have tried to suggest that the study of language may very well, as was traditionally supposed, provide a remarkably favorable perspective for the study of human mental processes. The creative aspect of language use, when investigated with care and respect for the facts, shows that current notions of habit and generalization as determinants of behavior or knowledge are quite inadequate. This is polite professorial talk. They are deceptive. One of the peculiarities of linguistics is that the understanding of the mind was so addicted to an engraved habit that posed itself as the tradition, that it wasn't until the 19th century when European and American linguists began researching American Indian languages and discovering that American Indian languages are some of the most complex languages on the planet. Algonquin has fourth, fifth, and sixth person declensions in their verbs. There are not only hundreds of American Indian languages, but their complexity is almost baffling. When the Bureau of American Indian Publications put together 2 huge volumes, I'll bring them next week, it was almost 2,000 pages of just a cursorial overlook at American Indian languages. And it was apparent that linguistics had not even scratched the surface on the way in which it isn't so much that language conditions symbols and thought, but that the flow of language is, in physics it's called the path integral. The flow of experience, language, has within it images that are like the rollers upon which the flow occurs. If you like, they're like the rocks in the stream bed that purify the language as it goes along, so that the language with its imagery becomes more and more expressive of the feeling tones of experience. So images and feelings are, I have to use an alchemical term, they're annealed in experience through language. But that they have in this an integral bias of a time forward arrow. So that the Greek word about the characteristic of the way in which this language experience with its images and its feelings has a structure. It has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. We call that a plot. Well, the Greek word for plot is mythos. It is not only that there's a storyline, but the path integral of experience carves out that kind of energy frequency out of which the symbolic mind takes its whole genesis. So that language is the source of the way in which the symbolic thought will characterize its structure. And that this is indelibly so because it rearranges not only the neuronal patterns, but the brain cells themselves. Different languages have different areas of the brain where they have their nexus. Japanese language is much further back than English or any other European language. The brain is configured by language. But the figuration that initials the way the configuration will go are the existentials. The things of the world, the ritual actions of the world and of ourselves in that world with those things, so that ritual base is the streambed in which the flow of experience. Consciousness does not have a stream. It's the stream of experience that was symbolically mischaracterized as the stream of consciousness. The symbolic structure integrals that and has its basis in that way, and is satisfied to complete that cycle. And its cycle is considered by itself, by its own structure of confirming and proving by logic, that it's finished when it has a very perfect mirror-like reflection of the way things are. The classic Roman physics first in 50 BC was by Lucretius, De Rerum Natura. The translation of the title literally means the way things are. So that the functional, operational tone is one of practicality. And the practicality is formulated by a pragmatism. The pragmatic actual action is the base upon which the practicality of the doing of one's actions, of the arranging of the things in the world, of the existentials, of one's existentiality, and that the language then is that mythic horizon within that geologic strata, within that, not just that stream bed, but the whole geological strata of existentiality conditions what it can do. So that the mind, when it completes that cycle, is completed by making itself as refined a reflector as can be, the mirror. The Latin word for it is speculum. And one finds in high medieval sophisticated philosophy always the speculum of this or that. The perfection of the mirror mind. This happens east and west. It's a characteristic. It's a characteristic of not having a conscious dimension, of reducing by constraining, by filtering, by deletions, by projections, by absurdities, by surrealities, so that there are only glimpses of the infinite field of conscious vision. And one calls them hunches, or one calls them an insight, or a moment of inspiration. With having no capacity, because there is no alerting that it can even be something that can be done, there's no capacity to stay there. There's no capacity to have a continuous function. And the key to it, to the conscious dimension, if you maintain the endeavor of a continuous function, what is revealed is that the further dimension that one is involved in also is at the very source of the existentiality itself, and one comes out with something like quantum field theory. quantum field theory of point particles and strings. The difficulty in it, and it's a very great difficulty. This is the first edition of the revision of S-matrix theory of strong interactions. This is the way which by the early 1960s particle physics was able to see that there were two different avenues seemingly that one could investigate. One of them was developed by Werner Heisenberg, and then for reasons which probably have not yet been made clear, because he was the intellectual physical genius for Nazi Germany, and something in him might have just done a non-cooperation. He abandoned what became S-matrix theory, and the person who really developed it was John Archibald Wheeler. This is a lecture note and reprint volume by Jeffrey Chew, who was at UC Berkeley. He was there in the 50s and was sort of a legend of the place. The center there was the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory. E.O. Lawrence, Ernest Lawrence, was the first person to build a cyclotron. He did this in the mid-1930s there in Berkeley. And at the time, no one realized how potentially dangerous these things were. And the first one is actually right on the north part of the campus. I was taken there by the head programmer, Bill Hogan, in the mid-1960s, and it was an eerie experience to walk on the mezzanine walkway with the metal railings and all of the massive jumble of equipment, and there was the reactor, and out of it came the most gentle, spiritual, turquoise blue light imaginable. It was literally surreal. It was not a color in the spectrum of the world. It was a color out of space and out of time. And there was no mistaking. Bill was not only a great mathematician and programmer, he was a jazz trumpeter. And we used to go to jazz jam get-togethers from Monterey all the way up to Point Reyes and just all over the place. It was a quality that revealed for someone who was spiritually alerted the recognition of further dimensions being super real, being more real than what we were used to thinking was real, because they were not based upon a practicality founded on a pragmatic operator. This was a revelatory spiritual tone that was out of an operator that was prismatic rather than pragmatic. That one cannot follow the action using a mythic horizon based on an existential conditioning and summarized by symbolic structure of thought. This exceeds all of that. And Chew, in his book, has a little aside, because he was one of these early 1960s Berkeleyites. He writes, so that There can be no misunderstanding on the point of view of these lectures. Let me say at once that I believe in conventional association of fields with strongly interacting particles to be empty. There's no such thing. Third of a century later, there are huge textbooks on quantum field theory. I do not have firm convictions about leptons or photons, but it seems to me that no aspect of strong interactions has been clarified by the field concept. The kicker is that one can have a theory, but not a concept of quantum fields. If you take a concept of quantum fields and you pursue it to its integral suchness, you will find that it comes out zero, which is wonderfully revelatory. Of course it comes out zero. It has to come out zero. That's the whole source field out of which the whole shebang occurs in the first place. On the other hand, and it's exactly on the other hand, if you follow the theory precisely with refined mathematics, what will come out immediately, as they say, is a wall of divergences. Infinite infinities. All over the place, all the time. So you have to use an arbitrary series of filters and constraints. You have to use assumptions which cannot be proved, but we're going to go with them because we can get approximations that seem to work for us in the circular realm that we have. But the difficulty with circular realms, with circular cycles, and we talked about this last week, is that they get tangled into knots. Now you can, in a very sophisticated mathematical magic, pull a circle out of a knot, as long as you go to a fifth dimension. Because what makes the knot in the first place is the path integral of time. Because time is the first dimension. In a knot has a peculiar quality. It's a one-dimensional vector that is self-avoiding and so doesn't integrate with anything else, doesn't touch with anything else. It's like a selfish one dimension, and it ties itself into a knot. One of the great little volumes by Michael Atiyah, who is an Arab-English masterful person in Cambridge, England, The Geometry and Physics of Knots. We talked last week about how Michael Atiyah was the moderator between Stephen Hawking and Roger Penrose at the Isaac Newton conferences in Cambridge, England. And his really great short book, because no one can write big books on these kinds of things, The Geometry and Dynamics of Magnetic Monopoles, published by Princeton University Press. What's quintessential for us to recognize is that only a poetic language that exceeds a rhetorical expressiveness has any opportunity to generate the ecology of consciousness. And that in that ecology, it is not an integral, it's not a cycle, it's a differential ecology. And we talked earlier in this presentation how the closest approximation about 2,000 years ago was to make it a spiral that starts with the eye of a spiritual portrait and enlarges itself in a regular way. And that curve of that spiral occurs in nature, and it occurs in the shell of the chambered nautilus. So that when one looks at the seashell of the chambered nautilus and works it out in terms of its conscious expansion geometry, you get a universal cosmic, not a path integral, but a path differential. That works both ways. It spirals out and it spirals in at the same time, in a symmetry, in a supersymmetry. So that one now has a prismatic form, like the proverbial jewel in the lotus being the pedestal of presentation in the infinite field of differential consciousness, and the jewel being the diamond person that prismatically now is there and can refine oneself infinitely by cutting more and more facets to the jewel. And as two jewels coming together are able in their mutual radiance to tune to each other's resonances and eventually come together in a harmonic. And that this harmonic is extendable not only between two jeweled persons, but all jeweled beings, no matter where they occur in the cosmos. So Wheeler's autobiography before was called At Home in the Universe. In this super realm, there are no aliens. Everyone is at home. How did Jesus put it? My Father's home is a mansion of many rooms. How many? The latest Sloan Sky survey shows there are more than 1 trillion galaxies of trillions of stars. If you want to go figure, here's food for long life. When we come to something like quantum field theory, now we're dealing not with concepts which are like frozen ideas. The idea has its expression initially in a very refined way in Plato, who was able to do this because he was able to hear Socrates. And Socrates specialized in a cooperational use of language that took it out of the mythic time forward only arrow and introduced constantly the phenomena that if we get really tuned together as in companions in the same inquiry, we will exhaust the extraneousnesses very quickly, and there are stages and steps, therefore, that lead us to understanding together at the same time the same insight. A moment of truth. And that before then there was always a pro and con with many sub-positions that either could maintain, but Socrates maintained neither the pro nor the con, but the solution matrix within which the pro and con could achieve tuning. And when they were achieving tuning, that process was called therapia. It was a healing out of the dis-ease of deception and illness. And as one came together to that aletheia, not a moment of truth so much, but a point that could no longer be divided. The Greek word for division is diaresis. The process of the talk back and forth, pro and con, is a dialectic, but the therapia of tuning oneself together is a healing of the divisions, so that the truth is a solution, not an answer to either the pro or the con. It dissolves the pro and the con together into a higher dimension of recognition. The popular way of saying this is the aha moment. I see what you mean. And the embrace replaces the old pro and con thing of being able to grasp a point. Did you get my point? Whereas now we have become companions together, and we have now entered into the realm of philosophy, lovers of wisdom. We're both lovers of wisdom, or we're all lovers of wisdom. And when we do so, we are able then to lift ourselves completely out of the habitual-based ritual geology of the single path forward, integral, arrow of time mythos, and enter into a kaleidoscopic flow called history. So right at the very same time that you have Parmenides and Pythagoras, you have the beginnings of history with Herodotus. And right at the time when you have the refinement of Pythagoras through Parmenides and many others, Anaximander and so forth, to Plato, you have Thucydides. The Herodias history is that one takes all of the stories and puts them into a matrix that has the full span of many different kinds of human experience. So when you read Herodotus, his history is all the interesting ways in which people are different, and yet within that they're all a part of the family of man. With Plato and Thucydides, you have the recognition that if you do not use the conscious dimension to transform, to begin the transform of natural cycles, by allowing for the emergence of the real person to become a creative actor within the world as a transformer, Thucydides says, knowing what I do now, what I am going to relate to you will all happen again and again and again, because it is a closed cycle. The rise and fall of empires by the 21st century is a treadmill. And to have groups think they're sophisticated by going to have a new world order empire is the height of stupidity. It's like listening to a bully on the school playground saying, "You're going to play my game." Everyone should just walk off the recess field. Either go back to learning or to go fishing. We're going to talk next week more about the Green Bill of Rights, but I want to emphasize conscious ecology is quintessential to the health not only of the ecology of consciousness, but to the quintessential health of the cycle of nature. Because without the transforms that continually refresh nature, it would grow stale and it would perish. There's nothing more boring than completely successful tyranny. In his great Nobel Prize speech in 1954, William Faulkner, speaking in Stockholm, he loathed to go, but his daughter Jill said, "Dad, it's the Nobel Prize, and I want to go anyway." So he went with her. He said, "I refuse to accept the future where the complete planet is paved, and there are any number of way stations where at one pit stop you can get fueled, sexualed, enthused, and roar off again in the obstructionless planetary raceway. I refuse to accept that future," he said, "because there will always be a kicker in the works. There will always be someone talking, saying, 'I don't like this, it stinks.'" More next week.